this goes back to Reagan. This is like Reagan's dream. Mark Carney is Reagan's dream. Deregulate, break the unions, and shrink government so you can drown it in the bathtub.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy at the Broadband Institute. The federal government is making it loud and clear that they're switching things up on economic policy. In a CBC article from 10 years ago on the election of Justin Trudeau's majority government, the headline reads, "Canadians reject austerity talk, vote for Justin Trudeau's Keynesian economics." Quite the reversal from a headline from just a couple of weeks ago in the CBC that reads, "Carney's cabinet asked to find ambitious savings ahead of fall budget." Within that decade, Canadians have faced global economic shocks, from energy price crashes to a pandemic, and most recently and ongoing episodes of seller's inflation and the whiplash of U.S. trade policy. For most Keynesian economists, these economic shocks are not the time for retrenchment. But for the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher set, this is definitely the time to respond with free markets, deregulation, and cuts to everything. Prime Minister Mark Carney appears to be following this exact playbook. Earlier this summer in 2025, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne directed cabinet ministers to make major spending cuts up to 15% by 2028. With ministers being given just 2 months to propose cuts, Canadians are rather confused that austerity is happening under a Liberal government. Isn't this normally the domain of the Conservatives? While the Carney government still rides high in the polls compared to the dismal pre-leadership January numbers, these proclamations have not become apparent to Canadian voters, though signs indicate that our collective elbows are down with recent concessions to U.S. demands. Was this what was advertised during the 2025 campaign? To help us make sense of it all, we're joined by Angella MacEwen, a Broadband Institute research fellow and friend of the podcast and acting director of research at the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Angella, welcome back to the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thank you for having me, Clem.
And so it's interesting that the Toronto Star reports that these cuts will work out to be at least $21.5 billion in the final year. And this is ironic to me, given that the Parliamentary Budget Officer just earlier this year reported that a progressive wealth tax on the 1% richest would bring in at least $23 billion a year. Sounds about break even to me if this government even wanted to maintain services and transfers as is, but they're not doing that. And in your recent Substack post entitled Cuts, Cuts, and More Cuts, you wrote that this only makes sense if you don't think what the federal government actually does is useful. What did you mean by this, and what's the idea behind these cuts?
Right. So there is something to be said for regularly taking a look and making sure that you're deploying your assets as efficiently as possible to accomplish whatever it is that you want to do, right? And progressives are actually, really good at that because we actually often are operating without big budgets. And so we want to be thoughtful about how we're spending our money. Absolutely. But the way that these cuts have been announced and introduced is not so much as let's be really thoughtful so that we can maximize what we are doing with our money. It's we need to spend less money. We need to shrink government. I don't even care how. 7.5% out of your budget next year, cut 10% the year after, and 15% in the final year. And so it's just across the board cuts for all departments. We're told that defense got the letter as well, but we know that they've promised new spending for defense that will counteract that. The numbers might actually even be bigger because since I wrote that post, the letters apparently has gone out to crown corporations as well. And the final number looked like 25 billion. So they had talked about how CBC was underfunded and they were going to shore that up. But now CBC is being asked to cut more out of its budget rather than be shored up. So the approach here is not be thoughtful about how we're delivering things and try to maximize the value. It's we need to spend less overall. And so that indicates to me that there is a general sense that it would be okay if we just didn't do things. And they don't even care which things it is that we don't do. They're like, you pick. It's fine. And so What probably is going to happen is the way that he said what parts of things are getting cut is like operational spending and not investing in things. And so that's going to be workers, right? It's going to have to be workers. They've talked about replacing people with AI in order to do things more efficiently. It's hard to imagine how AI could replace the function of immigration officers who are helping people navigate that system, people who answer the phone for employment insurance and are helping people navigate that system. Any number of things that the government does in terms of oversight, in terms of policy development, in terms of interacting with the public. You only send out this letter and tell people broadly to cut, like, you're doing 10 things. Next year, I only want you to do 9 of them. And I don't care which 9 you pick. It's really, really troubling. And that really does indicate to me, and you have Francois Champagne saying, yeah, it's going to be fine. And so you only think it's going to be fine if you don't think that 10% of workers were doing anything important, right? Otherwise, you recognize that there's going to have to be some trade-offs and some cuts, right? There's going to have to be stuff that doesn't get done. And usually, I mean, what's happened in the past is stuff gets privatized, stuff gets offloaded to other levels of government, or stuff doesn't get done. So when Harper cut, people couldn't get a hold of anyone for EI, right? Like you just couldn't get through. And to do something like that, Harper did that during a recession when we were still trying to recover from the financial crisis. We are now potentially entering a recession. And so we are not going to have the supports that we need from the federal government. We're trying to build housing, and you're cutting 10% of the people who help that happen, right? So I don't see how anyone can look at the current situation where he said elbows up. We're going to rebuild Canada. We're going to become more independent. We are going to focus on building the things that we need in Canada. And then at the same time, absolutely devastate the capacity of the federal public service to have any role in that.
And speaking of the public service, you compare this moment to past waves of austerity in Canada. There's the infamous Chrétien-Martin 1995 budget that cut 19% of operational spending. You just alluded to Harper's 2012 deficit reduction action plan that led to 19,000 federal public service job losses. Given these experiences, the public service actually seemed positioned for cuts ahead of the last election, no matter who won. On November 8th, 2024, the Canadian Association of Professional Employees issued a statement opposing any government budget measures that target workforce adjustment. The Public Service Alliance of Canada on December 23rd stated that Treasury Board President Anita Anand promised that government spending cuts wouldn't harm the services families depend on, but those promises keep falling short. There's been signaling for some time that cuts would be coming, and a historical precedent for this between Liberal and Conservative governments. And so the public service has been ringing this alarm bell for quite some time. But do you think Canadians are listening to this warning?
No, I don't think that Canadians know what the federal public service does always. I know during the federal public sector strike in 2023, I did a fair amount of media talking to people about it, and people were really surprised that, you know, there were Department of Agriculture federal public servants across the country that were involved in, you know, research and testing things to make sure that they're safe, and, you know, maybe don't make a huge amount of money. People think that public servants are, you know, write reports and sit in an office, which is important and part of it. But part of what they do is actually, you know, they're inspectors that go out and make sure that safety regulations are being enforced. And so it's hard to know, really, just as a regular Canadian, well, is that the number of people that we need to be doing that job or not? They don't necessarily know who the federal public service is and what they do. And so I think that the unions for these workers have been trying to paint that picture a bit more so that people know, you know, they work in all aspects. There's transportation, there's, I said, like food safety, there's all kinds of really important roles, there have been issues with delays, partly because of underfunding, and so it takes a while to get a passport, or it takes a while to get into employment insurance, or it takes a while to get stuff from the federal government, and so there's an assumption that, well, they're not doing a good job, so at least I should save some money on my taxes, that kind of thing. But what we've seen is there was, an increase during COVID-19 because there was a lot to respond to. Some of those workers did get cut in the 2024 budget. Justin Trudeau already cut about $7 billion out of operational spending was the plan. And so a bunch of workers who had been hired on temporarily in call center type roles have already been cut, and there were already departments that were cutting staff. I was in the lockup with somebody from PSAC, and the budget said things like, we're going to hire new people in these roles, and the person from PSAC was like, well, is that on top of the several thousand people that I know you've already fired, or is that to replace, are you hiring like 100 people to replace those thousands of workers? And they were like, yeah, no, it's we're hiring 100, and we're just not talking about the thousands that we've fired. So Canadians also don't know about that because the messaging from the government is not entirely honest or straightforward. It says, oh, we're hiring new people, but they're not. They've actually let a bunch of temporary contracts expire. And so when you don't have that sort of clear information, you don't have that honest messaging, you don't know, it's hard to judge how much do we actually need to spend on this. And then you have somebody who's a banker, who seems very competent, who seems very, like, oh, he's managed crises before, he must know what he's doing. There's a bit of a sense, I feel, from Canadians that like, oh, this must be necessary. But when you have a government that was elected in May, say by September, we want plans to cut 15% of the federal public's operating budget in 3 years, there is no way that has been well thought out. You mentioned Chrétien. That was a 2-year process where they met with departments and they had priorities. They said, this is what we want to prioritize. This is what we think is important for government to be doing. And anything else you should be cutting. Stephen Harper actually did the same thing. They had like a process, a stepped process where they met with departments and they thought about things. And it still felt like when Harper did it, that it was just across the board cuts. They were just shrinking departments and not necessarily being thoughtful. But there was some thought into what was being included in the cuts and how it should happen. And so this is more like Doge than anything the Canadian Federal Public Service has ever seen. And it's on top of, waves and waves of it happening before. So we are already structurally not in a really great place. And they're like, nope, just get rid of X percent by September. We want to be able to put it in the budget that this is what's going to happen. And you see departments already making decisions. And it's so anti-democratic as well to have run on a platform in May that we're going to expand the CBC. We're going to cap the public service, not cut it. To then turn around and say in the summer, when nobody's really paying attention, in the middle of a trade war with Donald Trump, they've got this kind of news shield where they can kind of do stuff, and it doesn't ever seem as bad as what Trump is doing. So, that's helpful for them as well to say, yeah, we're going to cut 10%, just figure it out. And I think it's causing a fair amount of panic. It's not really a very to be those workers trying to make those decisions, and in that environment, it's got to be pretty nightmarish.
And so, alluding to Doge, we'll get to that in a few moments. But what we also saw in the last election campaign, what was promised were these cuts, but it is kind of obscured behind some creative accounting. That last platform obscured cuts through calling for public investments, but at the same time promising private sector handouts. That might be what's behind this shift from operating to capital budgets, which really fudges a lot of these numbers. And so it's still unclear about what's getting cut, though We obviously know about some clear commitments to investments of public money, for instance, in guns and ammo, with the promise of spending 5% of GDP on the military by 2035, or about $150 billion a year. And for comparison, this is twice as much as Canadians spend on education annually. And so any increase in spending on the military will mean cuts everywhere else when tax cuts are included in that final accounting. It's still unclear what is being cut. And I think you alluded to this earlier, but with things like food inspectors being cut, or other services that are important to everyday life. But can you tell us what you're
and important to trade actually too, right? Because if our food isn't meeting the standards of the EU, they're not going to buy it, right? So
who do you think is going to feel this impact the most from these cuts?
Yeah. Okay, so you asked this in the first question, and this actually comes back to that. Their whole philosophy is government bad, private sector good. And so we're going to cut government, bureaucracy, red tape, inspectors, and we're going to funnel things into the private sector. He started up several new financing tools for the private sector. So ways for government to give money to the private sector at a lower cost, or maybe even some of it getting written off. And so the clear messaging, he hides it in this, we're going to build, right? We're going to build things, but he's not talking about building publicly owned infrastructure. He's not talking about government investing in ports and airports and high-speed rail and electrical grids. He's talking about government giving money to the private sector so they can build whatever they want, right? And whatever works for them. And the problem with that is, like, you asked who loses. We all lose. Canada as a whole loses. Who wins? Well-placed private sector actors who are able to get exactly what they want, where they want it, when they want it. And so any given private sector actor wants infrastructure only exactly where it will provide them profit. The federal government of Canada should want infrastructure where it benefits the economy of Canada as a whole, where it levels the playing field, where it enables broad economic activity, right? So the government of Canada should want to make it cheaper to get food to the north. Private sector's actors aren't going to want to do that because there's no profit there in it for them. So the government should be thinking about, where do we need to build infrastructure where there isn't going to be a profit, instead of what they're thinking of is, how do we get money to private sector actors who are looking to make a profit? And it's exactly the wrong thing. What we've seen, this goes back to Reagan. This is like Reagan's dream. Mark Carney is Reagan's dream. Deregulate, break the unions, and shrink government so you can drown it in the bathtub. And so he's doing this. He's cutting regulations. He's cutting funding for government. He's cutting, in the name of getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, he's cutting federal oversight for food safety, for environmental regulations, for all of this stuff around infrastructure. And what will happen is just this intensification of what we've seen under that Reaganomics economic project, which is a concentration of wealth at the top and a real lessening of opportunities for everyone. It's more expensive to buy a house. People spend a lot of money on university and struggle to get a stable job. It's really expensive to buy food. Like, everything gets more and more expensive. Wages don't keep up. We're all so busy. We can't fight back. And we're told that we have to do this. We have to balance the books in order to be fiscally responsible. And we have to give money to the private sector because that's how economic activity gets generated. But the truth is that under this service, we're underfunding post-secondary education. What's going to help fund economic recovery? Investment in public education from like kindergarten all the way through university. That's what stimulates the economy, and investment in public infrastructure all across Canada. That's what stimulates the economy and increases our productivity. Those two things, for government to invest in those two things, that increases productivity. Last year, that's what we were talking about. And that's how you do it, with government investment in things that enable the rest of us to do what needs to happen, instead of just giving subsidies to specific actors so that they can get what they want.
And lastly here, the Fraser Institute in April 2025 asked the question, does Canada need a Doge? Essentially, a copy of the already failed Elon Musk-led Department of Government Efficiency under the Trump administration that was named after a tired old meme, but had the sinister job of cutting services and doing deregulation to the point of corruption, administered by children for the US federal government. The proposed cuts to Canada's federal public service have also been described as Doge Light. And according to Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Ricardo Tranjan in the Toronto Star in July, income inequality reached a new high in Canada, as reported by Statistics Canada in its latest release. Here's why Ottawa's Doge-style cuts will only make it worse. Carney's government looks set to unleash Doge by another name later this year. What do you think progressives should be doing inside and outside of government to push back against this austerity agenda and protect public services?
That's a really good question. I think one thing that's useful is to talk about what's getting cut and the value of what's getting cut. We've seen with Doge where the children didn't understand the complexity of what was happening and they were cutting Social Security to widows, and they're like, oh, there's all of these ones that were born on this date, and it's like, yeah, that's a COBOL coding reference. Like, it was so complex and there were so many pieces that they didn't understand, and they walked in assuming they were the smartest guy in the room and assuming that it would be easy to cut and assuming that government didn't do anything valuable, and then they made a giant mess, because when you walk in with those assumptions, you end up cutting benefits to widows, and you end up cutting benefits to, the orphaned children of recipients, and you end up getting rid of programs that you thought were helpful, and it becomes counterintuitive. So I'm going to give you an example from Ontario. The Ontario government decided to cut healthcare benefits for people who were coming out of prison. And so there were people in prison who had methadone treatment, and when they came out of prison, they now had to wait, I think it was like 30 days in order to qualify for that treatment again. So you take people that you have been giving medicine to, and they come out of prison and now they no longer qualify for that medicine. What do you think is going to happen to those people? And what do you think the costs are going to be to the system of not giving them that necessary healthcare that they needed? These are the kinds of things that are going to happen. I guarantee it. It's going to cost more money to the system in the long run. They are going to cut benefits in one place that are going to cause higher expenses in another place, because they don't understand how the system works as a whole. And so whenever you cut here, you're squeezing those costs off onto somebody else. And because we have a social safety net, because we live in a society, we're all going to bear those costs. So talking about how the system works together, talking about what the benefits of the workers whose jobs might be cut. It's hard to do before the budget comes out, because we don't know where the cuts are going to be. And I think that's part of their plan, is to socialize the size of the cuts before we can make it tangible, make it real, make people understand. And so that, once the budget's in place, the idea will be, well, it's already happening. There's nothing you can do. And that's never true. There is always something that you can do. There is always a way that you can push back. And so paying attention and responding forcefully, quickly. The Department of Immigration put out a list on June 24th. They removed 178 postgraduate work permit classifications. They're like, oh, if you're applying to these programs, you no longer qualify for the post-graduation work permit. And immediately the next day, colleges and universities sent a letter to the department and said, this is devastating, please reconsider. And on July 4th, they reconsidered and they reinstated those classifications. And so I do think that paying attention to programs and transfers and things that you're worried about might get cut, and as soon as there's some indication, responding forcefully and explaining what that loss will be, both to the public and to the minister, will be useful it is a little bit like Steve Bannon's flood the zone, because I think we're going to get flooded with a bunch of stuff, and we're going to be trying amongst ourselves to prioritize what gets saved. And I don't think we should be responding from a mindset of austerity. I don't think we should be accepting that premise. I think we should say we can actually afford all of this if we need it. Our perspective should not be government can only spend this money. Our perspective should be what do we need to do and how do we get it done? And approach it like that and say, no, we need to do these things. We need to find a way to get it done. And we can do that together. I'm really concerned about cuts to healthcare. The Minister of Health has now said, that they're not committing to the Safe Long-Term Care Act. There are 100 different programs that support LGBTQ youth, people with disabilities, women who have left abusive relationships. There's like these little programs that the federal government runs and administers to support provinces doing this work that could just be easily cut because, they're this one-off little program that the government can cut. And I think a divide and conquer approach is what they're hoping will be successful. And I think if we all support each other's demands, we don't come from this mindset of austerity that we have to compete for what gets saved, that we say, no, we're all in this together, and I'm standing behind your demand and I'm asking you to stand behind my demand. So solidarity, all the little fish swimming together. I really think that's going to be what saves us, and being loud and immediate and not accepting. The Liberals do this thing where they'll give you like a down payment. They'll like, oh, well, we'll do this little thing, and then later on we'll do the big thing that you asked for, and not accepting breadcrumbs.
Angela, where can people find more of your work and insights?
Well, I have a Substack that I intermittently post things on, and I also publish some stuff on qp.ca, Economy at Work. There is also the Progressive Economics Forum. I haven't posted there, but other progressive economists post there, so that would be something worth checking out as well.
Angela, thank you very much for joining us again on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thank you.
That was Angella MacEwen, Broadbent Institute Research Fellow and Acting Director of Research and Senior Economist at the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Subscribe to socialeconomics.substack.com for her economic analysis from a feminist working class point of view. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivejournal.ca, and get more from the Broadbent Institute by subscribing to our mailing list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe.